So here we are in the final year of Destiny, right in the Light and Darkness saga's ending, closing act. Bungie's kind of called this saga the first saga of Destiny, and this expansion is the ending of it here in June of this year. Now, you would think that right before the ultimate showdown with the enemy who has more or less been behind the curtain for 10 years, things around Destiny would kind of be popping. People would be playing, people would be talking about the game, things would be going crazy. That's what you would think, right? Because it's not necessarily the case. The truth been told, I have personally played Destiny less and less every year since probably middle of D2's life cycle. Now, there's a multitude of reasons as to why my playtime has gone down that are outside of the game itself, such as life, getting older, taking on new responsibility, having jobs, everything that's associated with that. But the game itself, at least to me, seems to have misplaced a little bit of the spark that I think it once had. And this could just be fatigue after, playing a franchise for 10 years. It very much could be fatigue. It's possible. Now, the reason I'm betting it's more than just fatigue is that the last year of Destiny has not only seen some of the lowest playtime by me, but also a multitude of my friends who used to play Destiny all the time like myself, in addition to the numbers that we've actually got from the Steam database, and Bungie's layoffs are indicating that they're also seeing some poor retention and pre-sale numbers. So I don't think it's just myself. Back in the Forsaken era of Destiny 2 and the years that kind of followed immediately with Forsaken, I think that this was kind of the peak time that people would be playing the game, including myself, every single day, week after week. New games would come out, we would stick to them for a few days, try them out, and then once we had had our fun, Destiny was kind of always that backdrop that would pull us back in. It's lost something, to me, that it once had, and whatever that pulling power is that it's lost, I desperately would like to have the game to have again. Now, when I think about the last year of Destiny, I can kind of home in on a few key areas of the game that have simply fallen short on a personal level for me to remain interested and keep playing the game. Now, those areas are the story, the loot, and the progression. Now, these are the biggest, probably three pillars holding up the game as far as, a full comprehensive game is concerned. But there are certain pain points within each of these pillars of Destiny that I think have been just excruciatingly mishandled, overlooked, or just underdeveloped for somebody like me who is an avid Destiny fan to care about the game like I used to. So let's start with the story first. Now, my experience with the Destiny 1 story, I would say, has been a series of just high peaks with, insane interest and reading into the story and the lore on the weapons and the armor, just deep intrigue and interest with the game. And there's also been times where I've just not cared at all about what's happening in the game from, a week-to-week perspective. Now, I think that this has definitely swayed to a lot more of the underdeveloped, not caring moments in the last year than the big pivotal moments, the interesting stories that I have looked into and read into a lot. Now, I think that some of the best examples of the weaker seasons and kind of the weaker story points in Destiny would have to be around seasons, like the Season of the Defiance, Season of the Plunder. Season of the Defiance, for instance, was the season right after Lightfall, where we had to go around and kind of rescue civilians that apparently the Cabal had captured. I don't believe it was ever really understood why that was happening. Also, Amanda Holliday died in the middle of this season, and it just had no story, no weight to it. Not to me. I didn't care. I wouldn't have known she died if there wasn't something on YouTube telling me, because I did not play that far into the season story, because again, there's just rescuing civilians. Once I'd rescued the civilians in the first week, I kind of knew the rest of the story. And Lightfall was out. We were focused on Lightfall. Additionally, let's talk about Season of the Plunder. So Season of the Plunder, I honestly, it's been some time. I want to say it was during the season, or it was during the year of the Witch Queen. I believe this is when we got Arc 3.0, if I'm not mistaken. And the theme was okay, I guess, pirate ship, plunder, and stuff like that. But I couldn't tell you anything that happened during Season of the Plunder. Season of the Plunder is just in there, and I don't remember anything of value happening. I think the Drifter was there too. Well, there was nothing interesting happening. So these are examples of times in Destiny in the seasonal structure, which, by the way, seasons are the overwhelming majority of where people play the game. The expansion's out for 2 or 3 months, and then the other 8 or 9 months of the year, we're doing season stuff. The seasonal weak points like Defiance and Plunder have kind of been what I've been feeling overwhelmingly for the last year. There's stories being told here that are kind of moving, into a finish line, or moving the bigger story towards a finish line, but only barely. They're just something to keep the game moving until the grittier, more interesting stories that have often been in expansions come about. Now, this year on Lightfall, I have paid attention to the story in probably the most minuscule amount possible. I think that this is partly because of my belief that Lightfall, at least narratively, was pretty poor. And I also believe that the Lightfall expansion was kind of put together in a rushed state, and more than likely the expansions, or the seasons, and the stories after that were probably also rushed. I believe that there was a need for Bungie to wedge something in the middle of Beyond Light, Witch Queen, and the final shape, and Lightfall just kind of had a bunch of story points thrown into it. I think they're underdeveloped and they're weaker, is my opinion. The Season of the Witch, Season of the Deep, and Season of the Wish have all been mid-seasons for the story element for me. Like everything after Lightfall, the only thing that I care about and am consciously kind of aware of caring is we need to get into the portal and pursue the Witness. I feel like every season there has been basically us, the Guardian, being told in order to accomplish that we need to jump through these 10 hoops of story this season. And to me, again, I'm just super tunnel vision focused on the larger story, and to me that means I need to be here during the first week, and I need to pay attention to what happens at the ending, because those are really the only 2 points that the larger Lightfall, Witness, Traveler story is going to be progressed, and it's exactly kind of what's happened and played out as far as my playtime with the game. I play during the first week, I pay attention to the story during that first week. It typically is followed by narrative that tells us we have to wait until something is ready, and then during the last week of the story, that thing happens, and then we're ready for the next season's story. That's how it has kind of gone. All I care about is us getting into the Traveler, learning more about the Witness. The only times that anything has been productive or interesting is the beginning of the season and the ending of the season. The 5 to 7 weeks in the middle of that season is nothing but rinse and repeat activities, and get told some further dialogue that really just sums up to wait until next week, wait until next week, wait until next week. Something happened, new season. Now, I know that I'm definitely condensing down lots of the dialogue. There's been some good cutscenes. There's been some decent story beats, in these seasons themselves. But to me, as, the player that I am, I care about the big bad guy that's been introduced in Destiny. The moment that you introduced the Witness in the Witch Queen expansion, every other story that doesn't focus or push us further to fighting him in a meaningful way doesn't hold my interest as much as a season that it does those things. Or the fluff between these events just doesn't hold my interest. Now, some seasons in Destiny that have been the most interesting to me, I would have to say, are things like Season of the Splicer, Season of the Worthy, Season of Opulence, Season of Dawn. All of these seasons to me have something in common, which is that they have their own self-contained story arcs that I find interesting, and those held my interest as they were all setting up conflicts, providing a rising action in that story, and giving meaningful conclusions to those acts, and those were all happening within a season. There was never a case where any single one of those seasons was saying, there's a big bad guy you all fought last season, we'll do a few steps here and you'll be closer to beating him at the end of the season. There's none of that. It's always been kind of, here's the story, here's the bad guy, here's how you fight them, here's how you win, and it's been kind of a satisfying story arc in those instances, which is why I think that I like them more. I don't get the feeling that any of the seasons really for the last year have had that kind of staying power. The best, I suppose, would be Season of the Witch, which involved us kind of fighting Xivu Arath for being the ultimate power within the Hive. But to be honest, Xivu Arath has been an antagonist for like 5 different seasons and just keeps coming back, and we never actually get to fight her. And anytime that Xivu Arath's name is mentioned as an antagonist, I just immediately disregard it, as we're just going to be fighting our soldiers, we're not going to fight her. So anytime Xivu Arath's name is mentioned, it's kind of just an immediate minus points on the story, unless of course she actually shows up. And that's just probably a fatigue of Xivu Arath being used as a enemy, but we never actually get to fight her. Season of the Deep, it gave us some pretty good lore and interesting lore around the Witness, around the Veil, around everything that happened in Lightfall, which should have been in Lightfall. But eventually the season ended with, you need to talk to the Witch Queen in order to get into the Traveler. Okay. Season of the Wish rolls around. Riven wants us to collect her eggs, and then she will help us get to the portal. To me, sounds like nothing's going to happen except do these activities that you've read before to get eggs, and then at the very end, she'll give us what we want and move on to the story. That's how my mind has kind of read these stories. Again, the Bungie narrative team, they work hard. I have no doubt they work hard, but I believe that they were rushed for time and pushed as far as getting these seasons and story out. So I don't hold them completely to blame, is I guess what I want to say about that. Now, some of the suggestions that I actually have for Bungie from a player who, I do have an interest in the lore of Destiny. It's just not all the lore is equal to me and is interesting. And I think that they're actually probably making some changes and incorporating those lessons into their new episode structure, which is going to be happening after the final shape, just basically longer seasons. And I think their goal should be, the solution should be to get back to telling those smaller, self-contained stories within a season of Destiny. Again, I think the best moments in seasonal story to me are when they introduce the conflict in the season. We spend the weeks investigating and actually feeling like we're making progress towards solving this new conflict, and then resolving that conflict at the ending of the season. Pushing the larger narrative around until the expansion just kind of slow just doesn't work for me, and it's been used off and on for a while now as filler between expansions or between more interesting seasons. I personally want more Season of the Splicer stories. Season of the Worthy had a good story arc with the Crow and Keitel and everything like that. I don't want more narrative like Season of the Wish or Season of the Defiance, where things either just happen that aren't really that valid or important, or they're just being pushed as narrative filler while other things are going on in the background. Now, I want to highlight something. We're talking about the story, not content or the activities. This is a side note, but I think that the content and activities we've got within the last year have actually been amongst some of the best we've ever gotten for seasonal activities. The Coil, introduced in Season of the Wish, is excellent. Activities during the Season of the Deep and the Witch are very intuitive, very replayable, and I hope that Bungie iterates on these and learns from them, and I think they are, with the new activity coming with Into the Light Onslaught. So seasons need to have good activities, which I think Bungie has really hit home runs on this last year, but the reasons that those seasons have fallen short from a player attention, from my attention standpoint, I think the story plays into that, where we're just not interested in the story. A big part of the season is coming week after week to learn what's happening, learn what's new. But really, it just means come during the first week and then come during the last week to see how we push this thing forward. And that, to me, is an opportunity for improvement. Let's talk about the loot in Destiny. So loot in Destiny is a topic that can be expanded upon across multiple videos, but I think the simplest way to put it is that the loot in Destiny has been boring to me for quite some time. The last time that I was super excited, engaged, and grinding, really grinding for something in Destiny, was the pinnacle weapons that were introduced in the Crucible during Forsaken. This is me being honest. It's the last time I remember being just so focused and this tunnel vision focused on getting something like that. Bungie was hammering out some just crazy weapons that were insanely strong, and they had a reasonable amount of grind getting to the competitive score back then, and those weapons were the best of the best. Now, Bungie had a power creep problem that they've now introduced, where they're introducing these weapons that are substantially better than the other weapons in the sandbox, and now Bungie has to come up with a solution for this. The route that Bungie took is that those weapons that were introduced were too strong, and that they cannot introduce those kinds of weapons all the time that are that interesting and that effective. And they came up with a solution of sunsetting, which ultimately flopped on its face because of poor iteration. I've got a sunsetting video that talks about this, but long story short, they ended up just nerfing those weapons, and they stopped releasing weapons of that strength, of that caliber of effectiveness, and they've not done it since, in my opinion. There has been nothing in Destiny that has come close to the power of the micro missile in Mountaintop, the Magnificent Howl perk on Luna's Howl, or even the OG Redrix's Desperado. Whenever it first came out, there was just nothing at that caliber of effectiveness like that in the game. Another issue with the loot in Destiny is that the association of the difficulty of the activity to the effectiveness of the rewards from the activity. Some of the most challenging activities in Destiny, such as the Grandmaster Nightfalls and the Master Raids, will drop weapons and gear that are better than the normal versions of those activities, but only by a very small margin. A small margin that does not translate to the increase of difficulty. The association of the best loot in the game being accessible from the hardest parts of the game has been a topic that Bungie have given their stance on through their actions and the changes they've made to the game. And that is that all of the gear in the game should be accessible to everybody. I believe that this philosophy has ultimately harmed the natural feeling of chase that comes from pursuing harder content and growing your character's strength in order to overcome those challenges and earn those rewards that are leagues higher than the rest. I'll give you a practical example. Oftentimes, I will find myself wanting to run something challenging in Destiny, such as a Grandmaster or a Master Raid. And 9 out of 10 times, the stopping point that I end up asking myself is I ask myself, what am I going to get from doing this? Now, don't get me wrong, the experience of those activities is great, which is why I even consider running them in the first place. Destiny feels fun to play. I think that the activities in the game are enjoyable and they offer some degree of challenge, and I think Bungie's really been improving the activities and challenges they've added in the last year. But whenever I ask myself, what am I running this activity or these harder challenges for? The only thing that I can come up with is some currency, maybe some legendary weapons or exotic weapons that I have already gotten before, or an adept variation of a weapon that is maybe, on a good day, 5 to 10% better than the normal version of that weapon that you can get from the normal version of the activity. And it's at that point that I immediately lose the will that I had to run the activity and stay playing the game. The weapons and gear that we earn in Destiny, in my opinion, have almost had a damp cloth laid on top of them since Forsaken, so that we never have anything that recreates the problems of Luna's Howl and Mountaintop or Recluse. And again, this is ultimately kind of a way to stop power creep from happening in a world where all of our weapons and armor are usable forever. You know, Bungie has to kind of bring everything to a soft point of effectiveness, where everything is kind of close to effectiveness of everything else. A side effect of this is that everything is, of course, bland, and nothing immediately, when it's introduced, makes me want to cross any of these large challenges or bridges to acquire it, unless, of course, it's just for the sake of collecting the item. If something did make me jump onto the game and get it, it's very likely because that weapon is bugged, it's broke out of that net of safety that Bungie has thrown over all of the weapons in the game to prevent power creep. It's more than likely that net weapon's going to be nerfed and brought back in line in a short amount of time. Additionally, there is a broken system to me behind the incentive to run harder activities. The rewards that I get for doing harder content and pushing myself to min-max my character don't feel worthy of min-maxing a character. I would like to go more in depth on the loot in Destiny in another video, as I've already covered some of the problems with it in other videos before, but again, it's a topic that is so pivotal to the success of the game and keeping people like me interested that it's worth multiple videos, multiple discussions. For the purpose of this video, the retention of players like myself to the game, not having any interesting loot to chase, nothing that drives me into the upper echelons of content from a reward perspective, causes me to lose interest in playing the game very, very quickly. Now, the first suggestion that I want to give in regards to the loot is I want Bungie to experiment, be braver, and I want them to embrace chaos. The development of the game is leagues different than when pinnacle weapons of Forsaken were introduced. Bungie has gone solo. Bungie has then been bought by Sony. They have developed numerous tools and engine enhancements, so we've been told, that allow them to modify and develop the game more effectively. You know, back, I believe that Bungie indicated that they had very minimal capabilities to balance the game in different ways between PvP and PvE. The strongest weapons in the game that were just completely destroying the ecosystem of player versus player, and I believe it was this reason that the sunsetting discussion was so prominent, and the reason they had to kind of dampen all of the loot in the game to the point where things don't stick out anymore. I want Bungie to embrace experimentation again. Now, today Bungie has made it clear that they are able to balance weapons of their function between the sandboxes much more precisely. If Luna's Howl or Mountaintop were released into today's sandbox in their original release condition, I personally believe that Bungie does have the capability to modify the way that those weapons behave so that they are not broken in PvP, but they are just as strong and fun to play with as they were in PvE. That era of Destiny, where these weapons were king, is also the age of the infinite reloading wells that let you fire 21 shots of Mountaintop in 2 seconds. There was a lot of broken things back then in the game that contributed to this idea of these weapons being broken and strong. With a lot of those changes and balancing that they've done, these weapons, I believe, could exist in an ecosystem that we have today. Firm believer of this. Now, on the second point that I brought up, which was the disassociation between the difficulty of an activity and the rewards that were provided. This is going to sound just plain, but Bungie needs to nut up, is what I can tell you. I think there is never going to be a good feeling of player progression through your game that remains consistent and natural if the hardest things in the game do not reward the player for their time in meaningful ways. Grandmaster Nightfall reward adept weapons. These adepts, again, for the most part, are marginally better than that of the counterparts you can get from running normal strikes. And the same thing goes for raids. Master raids will drop weapons that are marginally better weapons, and the artifice armor that you can get from these raids will allow you to put an extra mod that gives a small bump in stats. Things need to be better than this. They need to be more effective. They need to be more leagues above other things in the game. Just some quick things I can think of. Weapons that drop from Grandmaster Nightfalls need to have exclusive pools of perks that are GM exclusive, really strong in that activity or other PvE capacities. Add cool weapons that look like they dropped from the boss, or unique armor sets that specifically come with shaders or ornaments that match the theme of the activity. This is something that Bungie's revisited and talked about, but strike-specific loot in Destiny 1 did this with things like the gauntlets and the gloves from the Golgoroth strike on the moon, or the strike on Oryx's ship, the Shield Brothers. You could add context-specific perks on these weapons and gear that makes them stronger in Grandmasters or strikes. People who love strikes should be incentivized to run Grandmasters to get these weapons and gear. That will further enhance their playtime and the enjoyment of doing what they love, which is strikes. Can't really tell you a time in Destiny where the feeling I got from Vanguard Strikes was I run these, I'm getting faster, I'm getting more effective at them, and that is in turn increasing my effectiveness of the activity, and that incentivization structure keeps going. I don't think there's ever been a time like that. Now, weapons that drop from the raids, I think, should have raid perks on them, exactly like they did in Destiny 1, where those weapons are inherently stronger at running that raid. Oracle Breaker on the original Vault of Glass weapons that you would get from normal Vault of Glass made running the hard version of Vault of Glass easier. So you would gear up in normal mode to run Master Mode, which Master Mode would then drop some of the best gear available in the game at that time. This is a natural flow of progression that just the loot is causing the player to take this journey on. And not having exceptionally good gear dropping from the exceptionally hard or difficult content in the game, I believe, is a flawed point of progression, or a flawed point of the loot, rather, that Bungie should revisit. Have an image in my head of what a season in Destiny could look like. It's something that I get excited for, just at the thought of how cool some of these ideas would be if Bungie were to implement them. I plan on making another video that will cover this fantasy that I have because it's just cool and I want to share it with you. Finally, let's talk about one of the last pillars of the game that I think has been hurting retention, at least with me. And that is the feeling of progression in Destiny. Destiny is a first-person MMO, which stands for Massively Multiplayer Online RPG, role-playing game. As you play the game and experience the world, there should be a sense of progression as you play. You are always on the lookout to increase the effectiveness of your player so that you can overcome new challenges, you can explore new, more difficult parts of the world, and you can contribute to your team or your fire team in the activities and modes that you play. In games like Destiny, meaningful progression comes in a few different forms. Now, the most obvious being the loot. If you get good weapons and armor, you get stronger. Over time, the expectation is that you will work to get new weapons and armor that are stronger than what you currently have, and this is something that will propel you into completing the most pinnacle challenges of Destiny, where the most pinnacle rewards should be earned. Secondly, games like Destiny usually have some kind of arbitrary leveling system associated with the player and the gear that they earn. It's a way to provide reusability factor to many of the weapons and the armor in the game, as you can, ascend this continuous source of power by getting weapons and armor that maybe you've got previously that have better perks, better stats, or a higher gear level associated with them. It essentially boils down to get weapons and get armor with higher power level, you get stronger. Look for the higher number. Now, these are two of the most basic forms of progression that exist in these kind of games, and they happen to exist in Destiny. Now, there are also questing, stories, subclasses, but they don't take that long to upgrade. The most long-form versions of progression in Destiny are the gear chase and the ascension of your power level or your gear level. Now, in a previous point, I've already established to you that the loot in Destiny, for me, and for other players I believe as well, has been in a stale state for a very long time. The natural flow of player progression to chase better rewards really falls flat once the player has their first set of legendary armor with mid stats and mid perks. You are able to beat every challenge in the game with a little bit of knowledge, including pinnacle content like GMs and master rates, using some weapons and armor you just got from the world drop pool. Immediately what this does is misguide players in needing to run content to farm new rewards to increase their effectiveness to overcome stronger challenges. If the weapons and armor you get relatively early in the game can carry you to victory in the hardest content in the game, then why would you run anything between then and running the pinnacle content? Your progression has peaked in a sense. If you put yourself through some of those other challenges or the normal versions of those challenges to gear yourself, you're only going to be making, again, minute improvements to the effectiveness of your character. Not worth it to somebody like myself. As soon as content is approachable and beatable by somebody like me, I am going to work to do just that. So the loot in Destiny to me is mid and has been dampened for power creep by Bungie. Most of the content in the game can be beaten by mid weapons because the gap between the strength of starter weapons, mid weapons, and the strength of pinnacle weapons can only be so large, according to Bungie. This is why they nerfed the pinnacles in Forsaken. The gap can't be as big as players like myself probably want it to be. And the degree that Bungie settled on allows for that mid starter gear to remain competitive against some of the best gear in the game. So if I as a player have no real incentive to run content, and because the gear in those activities is meaningless other than just to say that I've collected it, then we are good because we still have that second progression system that I talked about. The arbitrary leveling system, gear score system, that allows me to keep getting new pieces of gear that I can upgrade to higher level versions of those weapons and armor. That system exists. We can still do that. Right? No. This was gutted. A common complaint that Bungie received over the years is that players wanted to jump into the game and they wanted to experience the cool stuff now. Or new players were brought into the game because their friends play Destiny, and those new players wanted to catch up to their friends to run whatever they were running. The problem was that if the new player did this after 1 or 2 seasons had passed, then they had a large jump of power progression catching up that they would have to do in order to compete and run those activities with their friend. Now, other games solve this problem by introducing some kind of catch-up mechanic or system or set of gear that allows them to jump into the action straight away, maybe after a small quest. Bungie has even done this a few times with the Gift of the Thunderlord or quests that reward gear that brings you up to a good starting point where you can run activities with your friend. But eventually, Bungie in the year of Lightfall opted for a different approach. After the release of the annual expansion, which back was in February, and the jump in power level from the previous year to this year's expansion, there would be no raise of effective gear score between any seasons following that expansion for the remainder of the year. For the entire year of Lightfall, all gear score would remain capped, and it would stay capped until the next expansion. It would never go up. This accomplished a few things. Firstly, it allowed players who started the franchise 3 or 4 seasons into that year with the same power grind that their friend had when the expansion released, which according to Bungie was more approachable than instead having some kind of catch-up mechanic introduced in the beginning of the season. The new player would still have to run the story potentially, they'd still have to get up to light, but at least the goalposts were no longer moving between seasons, getting higher and higher. The other thing that this change accomplished is it was the nail in the coffin for players like myself who had continued to run activities and persist in the end game beyond the first week of the season. Remember, to a lot of players, including myself, loot in Destiny is very bland. Other than exotics and collecting one version of maybe every cool legendary in the game that might go away after some time, the loot has not been pulling me into the activities for a very long time. Like I've said, probably since Forsaken. Instead, what the game did have to pull me into activities was the pursuit of progression, of the gear getting stronger with higher gear score, infusing the higher level gear that I got from these hard challenges into the lower level gear that I had, effectively increasing my character's strength in the long term. And now, the upgrades that I could make to my Guardian's power level that were introduced each season, because you would raise that level and give me some more room to grind, is no longer there. Those upgrades are no longer something I can play for. My gear is the strongest gear in the game from a power level perspective at the beginning of the season, than it is at the ending of the season. And it's been like that since the expansion came out. Why should somebody like me keep playing the game past the first week? I can get all of the new season weapons and armor within that first week of the story. The only interesting things that happen in the story, again to me, are during that first week and during the final week, at least with these last few seasons. The middle weeks are always filler dialogue and activities that I can just blitz through at the end of the season. They just store up and I can do all of them at the end. Bungie has not had loot that gave a meaningful sense of progression in the game for a very long time. And this year, they removed the other progression system, the leveling system of gear, that would increase between seasons and add some artificial progression. It was completely arbitrary, but still, it was progression to players like me nonetheless. This is perhaps the biggest reason as to why I've not been playing the game. Now, some suggestions for improvements to the progression are very much tied to the loot point that I've brought up and discussed earlier. Bungie needs to take risks, make the loot more exciting and meaningful. Put it behind hard activities, and make players like myself, and even new players, want to engage themselves and challenge themselves to do these harder activities, to become more efficient, to get to these points where they can play these activities and earn the most pinnacle weapons in the game that aren't pinnacle by 5 or 10%. These need to be big, meaningful jumps that immediately distinguish the effectiveness of weapons from this difficulty of content from other difficulties of content. Fixing the loot in Destiny is a much larger fish to fry. I get it. There's lots of things Bungie could do to the loot to mix it up and change things. So in that case, I would suggest reintroducing raising the power level between seasons in Destiny. Adding a catch-up quest so that new players who are joining the season for the first time or after a hiatus have some way to bring themselves up to the current season's gear score if they play the first weekly story mission. That allows them to catch up to what is current, get into the action with their friends, and it also provides a bump in progression opportunity for players like myself who want to run the end game and grind their levels and have a reason to engage with the content you've built for us. I mentioned a few times that I have a vision for seasons and more of a permanent world of Destiny. An idea for what a game of this scope and size could do with some variation and shakeup of the Destiny formula. A few tricks from the bag of goodies they call the DCV, and a much needed rotation of the massive amount of armor sets and weapons that have been removed from the game for quite some time, the introduce of new perks that are crazy strong, and also not a harm to the permanent version of the game. I'll be posting, talking about my idea for a refresh of Seasons in Destiny, as I'm going to call it. But for now, this is where I'm going to leave you. I'm interested to know your takes on the player retention in Destiny. Are you as a player playing? If you are, what keeps you coming back to the game? Do you have a need or a feeling similar to me where you need to progress when you play the game? Or is just the gunplay, the fun of playing enough to have you throw a couple hours in every day? Was there a better time in Destiny where you were playing more than you are now? And if so, why do you think that is? Let me know in your comments. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Thank you all, and tune in again soon.